Hey guys, this is Mr. Ross. This is for the students who were not able to be in class during the lecture, and also for the students who were during the lecture but just need to kind of revisit the PowerPoint slides. So the areas that we're going to be looking at today are the early river valley civilizations. We're going to look at first Mesopotamia. We're going to look at Egypt and the Nile River Valley, the Indus River Valley, and in China along the Yellow River. So the first location that we're going to discuss today is Mesopotamia, which literally means the land between two rivers in Greek. And the two rivers that we're referring to is the Tigris and the Euphrates River. And this is known as the Fertile Crescent because of the rich and fertile farmland in between these two rivers. So in Mesopotamia, the political structure was set up in city-states. And city-states are independent cities that have the same culture, they have the same language, they practice the same religion, but each city acts independently of one another. It isn't like the United States where each city is part of a state government or under the federal government, but each city can make decisions independent of one another. And one of the first civilizations was Sumer, and it was originally ruled by priests. And then eventually, whenever there was warfare, warrior kings would take over, and that they would end up being kings. Also, one of the big things you're going to have to know for the test is Hammurabi's Code, or the Code of Hammurabi. This is the first known law code that we know of, and this is actually a picture of it right here. It's an 8-foot tall stone stele, and I believe it's in Paris, France, in the Louvre Museum. But Hammurabi's Code was 282 laws, and it was divided into sections like that our normal law code is now. It had family law, it had criminal law. This is the first time that we see the term an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But it was also based on the social class. And so, in other words, it was not equal under the law. And what that means is if you committed a crime and you were in the upper social class, well, then you were prescribed a certain punishment. But if you committed the same crime and you were part of a lower social class, well, then you had a much severe punishment. And so that's why it's not equal under the law. Economically, they were focused on farming. Majority of the people worked in fields or shops. They had a favorable geography. We already kind of talked about that with the map, with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. But they also had unpredictable flooding, and this could lead to famine because it could ruin crops when they didn't know it was going to flood. The religion was polytheistic, and that means that they worshipped many gods. And they also used the ziggurat. So this is the ziggurat, and if I had to describe the ziggurat in one word, I would say that it is a temple. All right, it was used as an impressive figure in the middle, or structure in the middle of a city, and it was a religious building, and that's actually what it looked like. So the social structure of Mesopotamia was a pyramid structure, which is going to be very similar to the other river valley civilizations. But at the top, you had your king and then government officials. And then towards the bottom, you had your farmers and slaves and laborers. And the largest of those groups were the laborers and artisans. And in Mesopotamia, slaves could actually earn freedom. So for inventions, if you've ever heard the term, let's not reinvent the wheel, well, the Mesopotamians were the first people to actually invent the wheel. They also invented the plow, which made it a lot easier to plant crops, and also the sail. They were also the first to use bronze, and bronze is a metal, let me change the thickness here, is a metal from copper, and tin. And both of these metals are pretty flexible, not very strong, but if you heat them up and you combine them together, it makes a very strong metal called bronze. Also, they had a unique form of writing called cuneiform, and this is actually what cuneiform looked like. And the best way to describe it is a wedge-shaped writing system, and it was used for record keeping. And so you can kind of see the different wedge shapes that they used, and so you do need to know that that's a distinguishing characteristic of Mesopotamia. They also had a number system based on the number 60, where our number system is based on the number 10. They developed arches and columns, and for art, they had an Epic of Gilgamesh. It was a poem, and it was very similar to the story of Noah's Ark. And that is kind of their lasting artistic achievement. All right, the next river valley civilization we're going to look at is Egypt. And so this is going to be along the Nile River in modern day Egypt, as well as the Delta. So in Egypt, they had a ruler known as a pharaoh, and you do need to know that term. And he ruled as a god on earth. And so this was also on your vocab sheet. It was a theocracy. A theocracy is when there's no distinction between the government and the religion. And the pharaoh was seen as a living god on earth. Economically, they were focused on agriculture and trade because of predictable flooding. So unlike Mesopotamia, the Egyptians pretty much knew when the Nile was going to flood every year, which made it convenient for farming because when it flooded, it carried with it nutritious sediment and minerals that fertilized the soil every year. Also, they were able to trade because the Nile flows north. However, the winds typically blow south, and so Egyptians were able to float down the river to the north, and they were able to sail back up the river south, which made it convenient for trading. The religion was also polytheistic, so again, that means many gods. And they also believed in an afterlife, and that's why you see the mummification. And they would basically take the organs of kings and put them in jars and then wrap them in a special cloth to preserve the body because they believed that they would go to an afterlife. So the social structure of Egypt was a lot like Mesopotamia, in which there was a social hierarchy. If you look over here, it still has the pyramid shape where you have the king or the pharaoh at the very top, and then you have peasants and slaves and laborers at the very bottom. One of the distinguishing characteristics of Egypt is that women had the same rights as men. And in fact, later in world history, we'll talk about Cleopatra, who was actually a female pharaoh in Egypt. Intellectually, you guys should be pretty familiar with the pyramids. It's one of the lasting, accomplishments of the Egyptian Empire. They're still around. It's one of the wonders of the world. They also built canals and dams. Their writing system was called hieroglyphics. Let me underline that for you. And this is what hieroglyphics kind of looked like. They were pictures that represented different letters and sounds. And they also had a very accurate calendar. And this calendar was really important because it would help predict when the flooding would occur. And so it was really important for the Egyptians to know when it was going to flood each year so it would fertilize their crops. They also practiced medicine, and so I put this picture in here because they would actually practice brain surgery, they think, because they found several skulls with removed portions, and they would actually practice brain surgery. And for art, we kind of included the pyramids, hieroglyphics, temples, and statues. All right, our third river valley civilization is the Yellow River, or the Honghe. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, but it's going to be in China along the Yellow River. So politically, in China, dynasties were ruled by noble or warrior nobles, which were headed by a king or an emperor. And there's two terms that you really need to know, which are the mandate of heaven that was on your vocab sheet and the dynastic cycle. So the mandate of heaven is the idea that the ruling dynasty had divine right to rule. And divine meaning godly, it basically meant that the people believed that the people or the dynasty in power had God's approval to rule. And the dynastic cycle is important, and you don't have to know every single step, but you do need to know the general premise of the dynastic cycle. So basically, a dynasty would achieve the mandate of heaven, and people believe that the new dynasty had the God's approval. Eventually, the dynasty would grow weaker, and as soon as something bad happened, like a flood or famine or natural disaster or invasion, that was a signal to the people that that dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and that they had lost God's approval to rule. And the next thing that followed was that the dynasty would be overthrown, and then a new dynasty would take over. And when that new dynasty took over, the people believed that they had achieved the mandate of heaven, or in other words, the divine right to rule. Really important that you guys know that. Economically, they were based on agriculture. They farmed millet, rice, and wheat with no metal tools. They also used standardized coins, which is pretty important for trade and exchanging goods. And their religion was closely tied to family. And there's another term that you probably need to know for the test. It's called filial piety. And it basically means respect for your elders. And the Chinese believe that the spirits of their ancestors could bring good luck or harm to them. And so it's kind of a silly example, but if you remember in the movie Mulan, her ancestors were following her throughout the movie, kind of helping her out. And so the Chinese believe that by worshiping and paying respect to elders, that would bring them good fortune. So their social system was similar to the other River Valley civilizations. There was a noble class of warriors at the top, and there was peasants and laborers at the bottom. The oldest male was in control of the family, and also, unlike Egypt, women were seen as inferior. So intellectually, the Shang dynasty is the first to leave a written record, and they used a writing system where characters are written to represent words. And so here is some examples of Chinese writing systems. And so each individual symbol represents one word. And so unlike in English, where you only have to memorize 26 letters and the sounds that are associated with those letters, in Chinese or Mandarin Chinese, you have to be able to read the entire picture and know the word for those pictures, which makes it more difficult. They also built walls around the cities for protection, and that's going to become a bigger theme in China for the rest of world history. They also used irrigation, which means it's a way to water crops, usually from a river. They also had bronze sculptures that they would produce, and probably their most valuable resource is their silk. And we'll find out here in a couple weeks that the Silk Road basically developed for the silk trade because it was such a valuable and lucrative commodity. All right, hang in there. This is the last one. This is the Indus River Valley civilization. And the reason why we put this picture on here is because this is Mesopotamia and this is the Indus River Valley, and these red lines are trade routes. And so we actually know that the Mesopotamians and the people in the Indus River Valley were traders. So the political system, we don't know a whole lot about the Indus River Valley because we can't actually read their writing. We can't decipher it, but we think that they had a strong central government, and in the next slide I'll get to why we think they had a strong central government. Economically, we think that they were prosperous. We know that they traded with the Mesopotamians, and obviously, like all the other River Valley civilizations, their economy was based on agriculture. The religion was similar to Hinduism. We think they believed in reincarnation. And socially, we think that they were generally equal and peaceful. Again, we don't know for sure. Most of what we know about the Indus River Valley is educated guesses. They've shown the beginnings of a caste system, which is basically when you're born into a caste. It doesn't matter how hard you work, you're kind of stuck there. So if you were born as a Sudra, then you would stay a Sudra your whole life. And they believed that if you lived a good life, that when you died, you would be reborn into either a higher or a lower caste, depending on how good of a life you lived in your previous life. Intellectually, we know that they were urban planners, and we know this because this is a map of Mohenjo-Daro, which is one of the major sites in the Indus River Valley. And it was located on a grid system, so with streets that ran north and south and east and west. And we also know, if you can kind of see here, they have the letter B and the letter A. They had city planning, and so there were certain sections of the city that were residential. There was also certain sections of the city that were all government buildings. And so we think that they had a strong central government because it would take a strong central government in order to control all the people that it took to build a city. Also, something that is unique to the Indus River Valley is they actually had their own plumbing and sewage system. And so that's something that was pretty high tech for thousands and thousands of years ago. And for art, we just know that they use seals for trading and for pictorial art. So that is the last slide I have for you guys. I hope this helped. I know when you just look at plain slides, it helps to kind of have a story to go along with the bullet points. So make sure you study, and best of luck on the test.